The secret weapons of Nazi Germany. On a cold morning in September 1944, a British pilot named John Gard was flying a routine reconnaissance mission over Belgium when something impossible screamed past his Spitfire at a speed that defied everything he knew about aviation. No propeller, no engine roar, just a howling mechanical shriek as a small aircraft shot by him going nearly 400 miles per hour, faster than his own plane could achieve. He radioed back to base, his voice shaking, trying to explain what he'd just witnessed. His commanders thought he was seeing things, suffering from combat fatigue perhaps, until other pilots started reporting the same phenomenon. What Gard had encountered was the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor that could climb to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes, and it was just one of dozens of revolutionary weapons that Nazi Germany was desperately developing in the final years of World War II. These weren't just incremental improvements on existing technology. These were weapons that would reshape warfare itself, some so advanced that they wouldn't be matched by other nations for years, even decades after the war ended. If you're fascinated by the hidden history of World War II and want to dive deeper into stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. The story of Nazi Germany's secret weapons doesn't begin in the panic of 1944, when the tide of war had turned irrevocably against the Third Reich. It begins years earlier, in the 1930s, when Germany was still bound by the chains of the Treaty of Versailles, that punishing peace agreement that had ended the First World War. The treaty had been designed to ensure Germany could never wage war again, placing strict limits on the size of their military, the types of weapons they could produce, and even the size of their navy. But the treaty had a fatal flaw. It had been written by men who'd just fought the last war, and like all military planners throughout history, they were preparing to prevent the previous conflict, not the next one. The restrictions focused heavily on conventional weapons, on battleships and artillery and standing armies, but it said very little about experimental technology, about rockets and jets and guided missiles, because in 1919, these things existed only in the realm of science fiction. German engineers and scientists, many of them quietly nursing their resentment over their nation's humiliation, saw an opportunity in this oversight. If they couldn't build better tanks than France or a larger navy than Britain, they would build weapons that no one else had even imagined yet. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, while the rest of the world assumed Germany had been defanged, research continued in secret. Rocket societies flourished, bringing together brilliant minds who were ostensibly interested in space exploration, but whose work would have very terrestrial applications. Wind tunnels were constructed to test radical aircraft designs. Chemical engineers experimented with new propellants and explosives. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and began openly defying the Versailles Treaty, these clandestine research programs suddenly had unlimited funding and government support. One of the earliest and most influential figures in this shadow world of experimental weaponry was a young aristocrat named Wernher von Braun. Born into Prussian nobility in 1912, von Braun had been fascinated by rockets since childhood, when his mother gave him a telescope and he became obsessed with the idea of traveling to other worlds. As a teenager, he joined the German Rocket Society, the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, where amateur enthusiasts gathered to discuss the wild dream of space travel. By 1932, at just 20 years old, von Braun's brilliance had caught the attention of the German army, which was searching for ways to develop long-range artillery that wouldn't violate the Versailles Treaty's restrictions. Rockets, after all, weren't mentioned in the treaty. The army offered von Braun funding for his research, and he accepted, perhaps not fully understanding or perhaps not caring about the Faustian bargain he was making. His dreams of reaching the stars would be financed by building weapons designed to rain death from the sky. Von Braun and his team were moved to a remote facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, where they could work in absolute secrecy. The location was perfect, isolated enough that their test launches wouldn't attract attention, but with enough space to build the massive infrastructure required for rocket development. Through the late 1930s, they worked through failure after failure, rockets that exploded on the launch pad or tumbled out of control or simply refused to ignite. But von Braun was relentless, brilliant, and backed by a regime that saw his work as potentially war-winning. By 1942, they achieved what seemed impossible. They launched a rocket that climbed to the edge of space over 50 miles high before arcing back down to Earth. It was the world's first object to reach space, a technological marvel that should have been cause for celebration across the scientific world. But this rocket was called the A4, and it would soon be renamed the V2, the Vengeance Weapon 2, and it would become the world's first ballistic missile. The V2 was like nothing anyone had seen before. Standing 46 feet tall and weighing over 13 tons at launch, it was powered by liquid oxygen and alcohol, a volatile combination that produced 56,000 pounds of thrust. Once launched, it would climb to altitudes of over 50 miles, then descend at speeds exceeding 3,500 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound, which meant you'd never hear it coming. The explosive warhead it carried wasn't particularly large, about a ton of amytal explosive, but that wasn't really the point. The V2 was a terror weapon, designed to strike without warning at cities far from the front lines, to demoralize civilian populations who thought they were safe from the war. More importantly, it was unstoppable. No fighter could intercept it, no anti-aircraft gun could shoot it down. Once it was launched, it would hit its target, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. The first V2 attack on London came on September 8, 1944, landing in Chiswick and killing 3 people. Over the following months, more than 3,000 V2s would be launched against Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp. Each launch was preceded by a carefully choreographed ballet of logistics, as the missiles couldn't be launched from permanent sites that would be bombed by the Allies. Instead, they were transported on mobile launchers, set up in clearings or city streets, fueled, aimed, and fired, all within a few hours, before the launchers would pack up and move to a new location. The psychological impact was devastating. Londoners had endured the Blitz, had learned to cope with air raid sirens and the distinctive sound of German bombers, but the V2 gave no warning. One moment you were walking down the street or sitting in your home, the next moment there was an earth-shattering explosion and a crater where a building used to be. The randomness of it, the complete inability to take any precautions, wore on civilian morale in a way that conventional bombing never quite achieved. But for all its technological sophistication, the V2 was arguably a strategic failure. Each missile cost as much as a German bomber aircraft to produce, but could only be used once, and carried a smaller payload than a bomber could deliver. The resources devoted to the V2 program, both in terms of money and materials, and the slave labor used to build them in underground factories, might have been better spent on more conventional weapons. Historians estimate that more people died building V2s than were killed by them, a grim calculus that speaks to the desperation and moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime in its final years. Yet the technological legacy of the V2 cannot be dismissed. After the war, both the United States and Soviet Union scrambled to capture German rocket scientists and haul away as many V2s and components as they could find. Wernher von Braun and much of his team surrendered to the Americans and would go on to form the core of the U.S. space program, eventually putting men on the moon with the Saturn V rocket, which was a direct descendant of the technology they developed at Peenemünde. While von Braun's team was perfecting the V2, other German engineers were revolutionizing a different field entirely: jet propulsion. The basic principle of the jet engine had been understood for years, but turning theory into a practical aircraft engine proved enormously difficult. A young German engineer named Hans von Ohain succeeded where others had failed, developing the world's first operational jet engine and seeing it fly in August 1939, just days before the war began, in the experimental Heinkel He 178. It was a brief flight, lasting only a few minutes, but it proved the concept worked. Simultaneously, in Britain, Frank Whittle was developing his own jet engine, and there's been debate ever since about who deserves credit for the invention, but there's no debate about who first put jet engines into combat. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, and when it appeared in the skies over Europe in 1944, it represented such a leap forward in performance that Allied pilots initially thought they were hallucinating. The Me-262 could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, nearly 200 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters of the day. It could outrun anything, outclimb anything, and when flown by a skilled pilot, it was nearly untouchable. Allied bomber crews, who'd grown accustomed to the threats posed by conventional German fighters, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that could appear as if from nowhere, make a single devastating attack pass with its 430mm cannons, and then zoom away before the defending fighters could react. The 30mm cannons were themselves revolutionary, firing shells heavy enough to tear apart a bomber with just a few hits, whereas conventional .50 caliber machine guns might require hundreds of rounds to bring down a heavy bomber. If the Me-262 had been introduced earlier and in greater numbers, it might have changed the course of the air war over Europe. German pilots who flew it described the experience as years ahead of anything else in the sky. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's highest-scoring fighter aces, flew an Me-262 and immediately recognized its potential, advocating loudly for it to be mass-produced as a fighter to defend Germany from the endless waves of Allied bombers. But here we encounter one of the great what-ifs of World War II, because Adolf Hitler, upon seeing the Me-262, insisted that it be developed as a bomber, not a fighter. Hitler was obsessed with retaliation, with striking back at Britain and at the Allied forces that had landed in France, and he saw the Me-262's speed as a way to deliver bombs that couldn't be intercepted. Precious months were wasted trying to modify the aircraft to carry bombs, months during which Allied bombers were systematically destroying German cities and industrial capacity. By the time the Me-262 entered combat in significant numbers as a fighter, it was too late. Germany lacked the fuel to fly them properly, lacked experienced pilots to fly them effectively, and lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in the numbers needed. Allied forces had also learned how to counter them, realizing that while the Me-262 was untouchable in the air, it was vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Allied fighters began loitering near known Me-262 bases, waiting to pounce when the jets were at their most vulnerable, slow and low to the ground. Nevertheless, in the brief period when Me-262s were active, they shot down over 500 Allied aircraft, a remarkable kill ratio that hints at what might have been. After the war, captured Me-262s were studied intensively by both American and Soviet engineers, and the lessons learned from them influenced the first generation of Allied jet fighters. Even more exotic than the Me-262 was the rocket-powered Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the aircraft that had so startled British pilot John Gard. The Comet was a radical design, a small swept-wing interceptor with no propeller and no jet engine, powered instead by a Walter rocket motor that burned an incredibly volatile mixture of chemicals called C-Stoff and T-Stoff. When these two substances came into contact, they ignited spontaneously with tremendous force, producing enough thrust to push the tiny aircraft to speeds of nearly 600 miles per hour and altitudes of over 40,000 feet. The Comet could climb almost vertically, reaching bomber formations in a fraction of the time it took conventional fighters, make a single devastating attack pass, then glide back to Earth once its fuel was exhausted, which happened after only about 8 minutes of powered flight. Flying the Comet was extraordinarily dangerous, not just because of enemy fire, but because of the aircraft itself. The fuel was so corrosive that if any leaked into the cockpit, it would dissolve the pilot. There were documented cases of pilots being essentially melted alive by their own aircraft's fuel. Landing was a controlled crash, as the Comet had no landing gear, instead using a retractable skid, and pilots had to glide the aircraft in dead stick, with no power and no second chances. If you misjudged your approach, you were done. Many Comet pilots were killed not by Allied guns, but by accidents, by explosions on the runway, by hard landings, by fuel leaks. Yet despite these horrific risks, Volunteer pilots lined up to fly the Comet, drawn by the prestige of flying the world's only rocket-powered fighter and by the desperate need to defend Germany from bombing. In combat, the Comet was a mixed success. Its incredible speed made it difficult to aim, as it flashed through bomber formations so fast that pilots had only seconds to line up a shot. The standard machine guns proved inadequate, as they required sustained fire to be effective, which was impossible given the Comet's closing speed. Some Comets were equipped with experimental weapons, including upward-firing cannons designed to be triggered automatically when the aircraft passed beneath a bomber, and even a weapons system that fired short-range rockets. But the Comet's biggest weakness was its fuel capacity. 8 minutes of powered flight meant that pilots had to launch at exactly the right moment, had to climb directly to the bombers, had to make their attack, and then had to glide back to base, all while Allied escort fighters were trying to shoot them down. Many Comet pilots found themselves gliding defenseless through sky full of enemies, easy prey once their fuel ran out. While these aircraft represented the cutting edge of aviation technology, German engineers were also developing weapons that seemed to come straight from science fiction. The Fritz X was the world's first precision-guided bomb, a radio-controlled weapon that could be steered onto its target by a bombardier in the aircraft that dropped it. Unlike conventional bombs, which simply fell wherever physics took them and required bombers to fly directly over their targets, the Fritz X could be guided onto targets from miles away. On September 9, 1943, the Fritz X scored its most spectacular success when it struck the Italian battleship Roma as Italy was attempting to surrender its fleet to the Allies. The Roma, one of the most powerful battleships in the world, was hit by 2 Fritz X bombs. One penetrated straight through the ship's armored deck and detonated in a magazine, causing a catastrophic explosion that broke the ship in half. It sank in minutes, taking over 1,400 men to the bottom with it, including the Italian admiral. This was the first time in history that a ship had been sunk by a guided weapon, a preview of how warfare would be conducted in the decades to come. The Germans also developed the HS-293, a glide bomb with a rocket booster, which was used to sink or damage dozens of Allied ships. These weapons forced the Allies to develop countermeasures, including radio jamming systems, and sparked an invisible war of electronic warfare that paralleled the shooting war. German scientists developed increasingly sophisticated guidance systems, and Allied scientists developed increasingly sophisticated jamming systems, each side trying to stay one step ahead of the other. Perhaps no German secret weapon program was more ambitious or more controversial than the effort to develop atomic weapons. For years after the war, there was a popular narrative that German atomic research never got very far, that their best scientists had fled to Britain and America, and that those who remained were incompetent or sabotaged their own efforts. The truth is more complex and more unsettling. Germany's atomic program, centered around physicist Werner Heisenberg, was aware of the basic principles of nuclear fission and understood that an atomic bomb was theoretically possible. Heisenberg and his colleagues made real progress in understanding nuclear physics, conducting experiments with uranium and heavy water, attempting to create a sustained nuclear reaction. The question that's haunted historians ever since is why they never succeeded in building a bomb. Some have argued that Heisenberg deliberately slowed the program, that he understood the moral implications of giving Hitler an atomic weapon and quietly steered the research away from weapons development and toward reactor research. Others argue that Germany simply lacked the resources, that building an atomic bomb required an industrial effort on the scale of the Manhattan Project. And Germany, by 1942 and 1943, was already stretched to the breaking point trying to fight a multi-front war. The heavy water plant in Norway that was critical to German nuclear research was sabotaged by Norwegian resistance fighters in a daring raid that became legendary. German attempts to rebuild the program were continually disrupted by Allied bombing and commando raids. There's also evidence that German scientists made crucial calculation errors that led them to underestimate how much uranium would be needed, sending them down theoretical dead ends. What we know for certain is that Germany never came close to building a working atomic bomb, but the fear that they might drove Allied efforts. When American forces raced across Germany in the final weeks of the war, One of their top priorities was securing German nuclear scientists and materials before the Soviets could get to them. The ALSOS mission, a secret intelligence operation, captured key German physicists including Heisenberg and interned them in England, where British intelligence secretly recorded their conversations. The transcripts of these conversations, declassified years later, show scientists who were surprised by the news of Hiroshima, who initially didn't believe the Allies had built an atomic bomb, because they assumed it was as difficult as their own failed efforts had proven to be. Beyond the rockets and jets and guided weapons, German engineers developed a menagerie of exotic weapons that ranged from practical to fantastical. The Sturmgewehr 44, literally the Storm Rifle 44, was the world's first assault rifle, firing an intermediate cartridge that was less powerful than a full rifle round but more powerful than a pistol round, allowing soldiers to carry more ammunition and fire in both semi-automatic and fully automatic modes. Modern assault rifles from the AK-47 to the M16 to the AR-15 all trace their lineage back to this weapon. The Germans developed infrared night vision equipment, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary for the time, allowing tank crews to see in complete darkness. They created wire-guided anti-tank missiles, where the operator could steer the missile onto the target using a joystick connected by a thin wire that spooled out behind the missile as it flew. Some projects ventured into the truly bizarre. The Landkreuzer P-1000 Ratte was a proposed super-heavy tank that would have weighed 1,000 tons, been armed with naval guns, and required a crew of over 40 people. It was so absurdly large that it could never have been practically deployed. It would have sunk into most roads and bridges, consumed fuel at a rate that would have required its own tanker trucks following behind it, and been an easy target for bombers. The project never progressed beyond initial designs before being cancelled as a waste of resources. Similarly impractical was the V3 Supergun, a massive artillery piece buried in a hillside in France, designed to bombard London from over 90 miles away. The gun used a series of explosive charges along the barrel to continually accelerate the shell, theoretically giving it incredible range. Allied intelligence discovered the site, and the RAF bombed it with enormous tallboy deep penetration bombs before it could ever be test-fired. The Nazis also invested heavily in developing chemical and biological weapons, though thankfully these were never deployed on a large scale. Germany had pioneered nerve agents, developing Tauben, sarin, and soman, chemicals so deadly that a single drop absorbed through the skin could kill within minutes. The fact that Hitler, himself a victim of gas attack during World War I, chose not to use these weapons has puzzled historians. The most likely explanation is that he feared Allied retaliation, not realizing that the Allies had not developed their own nerve agents and would have been defenseless against them. Germany also experimented with biological weapons, including weaponized plague, though these programs never advanced beyond research stages. One of the most revolutionary technologies to emerge from wartime Germany had nothing to do with weapons directly, but would reshape the post-war world: the computer. Konrad Zuse, a German engineer, built the world's first programmable computer, the Z3, in 1941. It used electromagnetic relays to perform calculations and could be programmed using punched tape. While primitive by modern standards, it was a fully functional computer years before similar machines were developed in Britain and America. Zuse's work was largely ignored during the war, as the German military didn't grasp its potential applications, but after the war, his designs influenced the first generation of commercial computers. Similarly, German work on synthetic fuels, born from necessity as Germany lacked natural oil reserves, led to processes for converting coal into gasoline that are still studied today. The submarine war also saw dramatic innovations. German U-boats had nearly strangled Britain in the early years of the war, but by 1943, the Allies had gained the upper hand through better radar, more escorts, and cracked German codes. Germany responded with the Type 21 U-boat, a revolutionary design that was decades ahead of its time. Unlike earlier U-boats, which were really surface ships that could dive temporarily, the Type 21 was a true submarine, designed to operate underwater for extended periods. It had a streamlined hull, powerful electric motors, and could travel submerged at speeds that made it nearly impossible to catch. It had sophisticated sonar and could reload its torpedoes while submerged, something earlier U-boats couldn't do. Fortunately for the Allies, the Type 21 entered service too late to affect the war's outcome. Only a handful were operational before Germany surrendered. But after the war, both the Americans and Soviets based their submarine designs on captured Type 22s. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these secret weapons programs was how they were produced. Many of the most advanced weapons were built using slave labor from concentration camps and forced labor from occupied territories. The V-2 rockets were manufactured in the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp, where prisoners worked in underground tunnels under horrific conditions. Thousands died from overwork, starvation, and casual brutality. The death rate among the workers was so high that more people died building V-2s than were killed by them when they were used as weapons. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect, but a deliberate policy. The Nazis viewed concentration camp prisoners as disposable labor, and the suffering and death of workers was considered irrelevant as long as the weapons got built. Wernher von Braun personally visited the underground factories, saw the conditions, and did nothing to stop it. After the war, when he was brought to America and lauded as a hero of the space program, this dark chapter of his biography was quietly buried for decades. As the war entered its final months, with Allied armies closing in from both east and west, Germany's secret weapons programs took on an air of desperation. Engineers proposed increasingly fantastical projects, rocket-powered interceptors that would be piloted by Hitler Youth volunteers on suicide missions, flying bombs that would be guided by pigeons trained to peck at targets on a screen, electromagnetic railguns that could shoot projectiles into space. Some of these projects existed only on paper, fevered dreams of scientists who couldn't accept that the war was lost. Others actually reached prototype stages before being abandoned as the infrastructure needed to build them was destroyed by bombing or overrun by advancing armies. The Horten HO-229 was one such weapon that almost made it. It was a flying wing design, essentially a flat triangle with no fuselage or tail, powered by twin jet engines. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, and it had remarkable performance, with a top speed potentially exceeding 600 miles per hour and a design that made it difficult to detect on radar. The prototype flew successfully in early 1945, and plans were made to put it into production, but Germany ran out of time. The factory where it was to be built was captured by American forces, and the prototype was shipped back to the United States for study. Its influence can be seen in modern stealth aircraft like the B-2 bomber. In the end, none of these wonder weapons could save Germany. For all their technological sophistication, they came too late, were produced in too small numbers, or were simply not effective enough to overcome the overwhelming material and manpower advantages that the Allies possessed by 1944 and 1945. Some historians argue that the resources devoted to these exotic weapons would have been better spent on conventional arms, on more tanks and fighters and artillery, on the unglamorous but essential tools of warfare. Others point out that many of these technologies, while too late to affect World War II, shaped the world that came after it. The Cold War arms race was built on German rocket technology. The jet age began with German jet engines, guided missiles, assault rifles, night vision, computers. All of these emerged from or were accelerated by wartime German research. The moral questions raised by these weapons and the men who built them are complex and uncomfortable. Many of the scientists and engineers who developed these technologies were convinced that they were defending their homeland, that they were engaged in legitimate military research no different from what Allied scientists were doing. Some, like Wernher von Braun, claimed after the war that they'd been apolitical scientists, interested only in advancing technology, who happened to live in Nazi Germany. This self-serving narrative ignores their willing participation in a genocidal regime, their use of slave labor, their development of weapons specifically designed to terrorize civilians. The decision by the United States and Soviet Union to recruit these men after the war, to overlook or excuse their collaboration with the Nazis in exchange for their expertise, remains controversial. When American forces reached Peenemünde, and other secret weapons facilities. They found warehouses full of documents, prototypes, and components. They found wind tunnels and test stands and production facilities that were years ahead of anything in America or Britain. They found scientists who were willing to work for whoever won the war. Operation Paperclip, the American program to bring German scientists to the United States, involved fabricating clean backgrounds for men who had been Nazi party members, who had used slave labor, who had committed what would today be considered war crimes. The justification was that if America didn't take them, the Soviets would, and in the emerging Cold War, this seemed like justification enough. The Soviets conducted their own version of Paperclip, forcibly relocating German scientists and their families to the Soviet Union and putting them to work on missile and aircraft programs. These German scientists formed the core of both American and Soviet missile programs in the 1950s and 1960s. Wernher von Braun became the face of the American space program, appearing on television to explain rocket science to the public, consulting on Disney shows about space travel, eventually heading the team that developed the Saturn V rocket that took astronauts to the moon. His past was quietly ignored, mentioned only rarely and then in the most sanitized terms. Soviet rocket designer Sergei Korolev, architect of the Soviet space program, worked with German engineers who had been brought east. The first Soviet ballistic missiles were essentially copies of the V-2, gradually improved and enlarged until they became the rockets that launched Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin. The influence of German wartime research extended into almost every field of military technology. The swept-wing design pioneered by German engineers became standard on jet aircraft because it allowed planes to fly faster with less drag. German research into missile guidance systems led directly to the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The assault rifle concept pioneered by the Sturmgewehr 44 became the standard infantry weapon worldwide. Even civilian technology benefited, as German advances in chemistry, materials science, and engineering were studied and adapted for peacetime use. But there were weapons even more exotic than those already mentioned. Projects so advanced or so strange that they seemed to blur the line between genius and madness. The aggregate series of rockets, of which the V-2 was just one member, included designs for intercontinental ballistic missiles that could strike New York from Europe. The A9/A10, also known as the America rocket, was a two-stage design where a massive booster rocket would launch a smaller winged second stage that could glide across the Atlantic Ocean and strike American cities. The physics were sound, the engineering was theoretically feasible, but the project never progressed beyond wind tunnel testing before the war ended. Yet the concept was viable enough that both American and Soviet engineers studied it carefully after the war, and the basic principle of a two-stage intercontinental missile became the foundation of Cold War nuclear arsenals. The Germans also developed what might be called the world's first cruise missile, distinct from the V-2 ballistic missile. The V-1, which actually preceded the V-2 in deployment, was a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine that produced a distinctive buzzing sound, earning it the nickname Buzz Bomb, or Doodlebug, among Londoners. The V-1 was much simpler and cheaper to produce than the V-2, essentially a flying bomb that flew a preset course until its fuel ran out, then dove to Earth. Over 10,000 V-1s were launched against Britain, primarily against London, and while they were slower than the V-2 and could be shot down by anti-aircraft fire or intercepted by fast fighters, they were produced in such numbers that they posed a significant threat. British fighter pilots developed a dangerous technique for defeating V-1s, flying alongside them and using their wing to tip the V-1 off course, sending it crashing into the countryside rather than urban areas. This required flying in close formation with a 1-ton bomb traveling at 400 miles per hour, close enough that your wingtip was just feet from the V-1's wing, then executing a precise maneuver that would destabilize the flying bomb without damaging your own aircraft. It was extraordinarily dangerous work that killed several pilots who misjudged the maneuver. The secret weapons program extended beyond rockets and jets into the realm of what we might call electronic warfare. German scientists developed radar systems that were, in some respects, more sophisticated than Allied equivalents, including the Würzburg radar that could track individual aircraft with remarkable precision. They created radar-guided anti-aircraft guns that could fire automatically at targets, an early form of automated weapon systems. The Germans also invested heavily in radar countermeasures, developing equipment to jam Allied radar and confusion devices that would create false signals, making one aircraft appear to be many on enemy radar screens. This sparked a technological arms race where each side tried to stay ahead of the other's electronic capabilities. The British would develop a new radar frequency. The Germans would eventually figure out how to jam it. The British would switch to a new system, and the cycle would repeat. One of the most secret German programs involved attempts to develop what they called death rays, directed energy weapons that sound like pure science fiction, but were based on real physics. German scientists experimented with focused microwave beams that could potentially disable aircraft electronics or even injure crews, with sonic weapons that would use intense sound waves to disrupt enemy formations, and with various schemes involving concentrated electromagnetic radiation. None of these projects produced practical weapons. The energy requirements were simply too enormous for the technology of the time, but the research wasn't nonsensical. The principles they were investigating would, decades later, lead to real directed energy weapons like the laser systems and microwave weapons that military forces deploy today. The intelligence war surrounding these secret weapons was as intense as the shooting war. British intelligence, through a combination of signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, spy networks, and interrogation of prisoners, gradually pieced together what Germany was developing. The discovery of the V2 program was particularly dramatic. British reconnaissance photos showed strange circular emplacements being built in northern France, structures that didn't match any known military installation. Analysts puzzled over them until an intercepted message mentioned large rockets, and suddenly the pieces fell into place. The British launched Operation Crossbow, a massive bombing campaign targeting suspected V-weapon sites, factories, and research facilities. Hundreds of bombers were diverted from other targets to attack these sites, and thousands of tons of bombs were dropped based on intelligence that was often incomplete or incorrect. The effort to locate and destroy the Peenemünde research facility became a top priority. British intelligence knew that some kind of secret weapons research was happening there, but they didn't know exactly what or how far along it was. In August 1943, the RAF launched Operation Hydra, sending nearly 600 bombers to attack Peenemünde in a daring night raid. The attack was partially successful. It killed several hundred workers and scientists, destroyed some facilities, and delayed the V2 program by several months. But it failed to completely destroy the research center. Werner von Braun and most of his key scientists survived, and the program continued, albeit with increased security and dispersal of facilities to make them harder to target. The Allies also attempted to sabotage German secret weapons through covert operations. One of the most successful was the raid on the Vemork heavy water plant in Norway, a facility that was critical to German atomic research. Heavy water, which contains deuterium instead of regular hydrogen, was needed as a neutron moderator for nuclear reactors, and the Vemork plant was one of the only facilities in the world that could produce it in quantity. In February 1943, Norwegian commandos trained by British Special Operations executed a raid on the plant, fighting their way past guards and placing explosives that destroyed the heavy water production equipment. The Germans rebuilt the plant, but a subsequent bombing raid and then a second sabotage operation that sank a ferry carrying heavy water back to Germany effectively ended large-scale German heavy water production. These operations may have been decisive in preventing Germany from developing nuclear weapons, though we'll never know for certain what might have happened if they'd had access to the materials they needed. Another aspect of the secret weapons program that deserves examination is the role of captured or coerced foreign scientists and engineers. As Germany occupied various countries, they gained access to talent and facilities that they put to work on their weapons programs. French engineers were forced to work on various projects. Czech factories produced components for German weapons. Scientists from across occupied Europe found themselves working on German research projects, sometimes willingly, often under duress. This raises complicated questions about collaboration and resistance, about what choices people had when facing occupation, and about how we judge those who made those choices. Some genuinely believed in the German cause, others were opportunists who saw a chance for advancement, and many simply tried to survive under impossible circumstances. The story of the secret weapons also includes spectacular failures and dead ends that consumed resources without producing results. The sun gun was one of the most bizarre, a proposed orbital mirror that would focus sunlight into a concentrated beam capable of burning cities. The concept came from a pre-war science fiction story, but German scientists actually studied it seriously, calculating the size of mirror needed, the orbit it would require, and how it might be constructed. They concluded it was theoretically possible, though the engineering challenges were insurmountable with 1940s technology. The fact that serious scientists spent time on such a fantastical project speaks to the desperation and lack of realistic assessment that characterized the late war period. Similarly impractical was the Silbervogel, or Silver Bird, a rocket-powered spaceplane designed by engineer Eugen Sanger that would launch on a rocket sled, accelerate to orbital velocities, then skip along the upper atmosphere like a stone skipping across water, each skip carrying it thousands of miles until it could drop a bomb on New York, before gliding back to land in Japanese-controlled territory. The physics were theoretically sound, but the engineering required was decades beyond what was possible at the time. The materials didn't exist that could withstand the heat of atmospheric re-entry. The guidance systems needed to navigate such a trajectory hadn't been invented, and the fuel requirements were astronomical. Yet this wasn't just a thought experiment. Sanger produced detailed engineering drawings, wind tunnel test results, and calculations that showed remarkable foresight about the challenges of hypersonic flight and space travel. After the war, both the Soviets and Americans studied his work, and concepts similar to the Silbervogel influenced later projects like the X-15 rocket plane and the space shuttle. The tale of the Ww2 Natter, or Viper, demonstrates how far Germany was willing to go in its desperation. This was a vertically launched rocket interceptor, essentially a manned missile, that would be launched straight up at incoming bomber formations, fire all its rockets at the bombers in a single salvo. Then the pilot would eject while the aircraft's reusable rocket motor descended by parachute to be recovered and used again. The entire flight would last only a few minutes. The Natter was test flown several times, and one test pilot was killed when the canopy separated during launch, causing the aircraft to crash. The program reached the point of deploying operational aircraft in the final weeks of the war, but there's no confirmed record of a Natter ever being used in combat. It represented the ultimate extreme of Germany's late war philosophy, throwing barely trained pilots into experimental aircraft on what were essentially suicide missions, in hopes of achieving some impossible victory. Looking back from our perspective over 80 years later, it's tempting to view Nazi Germany's secret weapons as footnotes to history, exotic failures that didn't change the war's outcome. But this misses the larger significance. These weapons represented a transformation in how war would be fought, a glimpse into a future where technology would matter more than individual courage, where push-button warfare would replace face-to-face combat, where civilians far from the front lines would be as vulnerable as soldiers in trenches. The V-2 rocket landing without warning on London prefigured the intercontinental ballistic missiles of the Cold War, weapons that made every city on Earth potentially vulnerable to destruction. The jet fighters screaming through the skies over Germany in 1945 were the ancestors of the supersonic fighters that patrol the skies today. The guided missiles sinking ships in the Mediterranean were the first examples of precision weapons that now dominate modern warfare. The secret weapons of Nazi Germany also raise profound questions about the relationship between science and morality, between technical achievement and human values. The men who built these weapons were often brilliant, creative, dedicated professionals who were also complicit in one of history's greatest evils. Their work advanced human knowledge and capability in ways that benefited the world while simultaneously serving a regime bent on conquest and genocide. How do we reconcile these contradictions? How do we evaluate the legacy of technologies developed for evil purposes, but later used for exploration and discovery? These aren't easy questions, and they remain relevant today as we grapple with emerging technologies from artificial intelligence to autonomous weapons to genetic engineering. The final accounting of Nazi Germany's secret weapons programs reveals a strange paradox. They failed to save the Third Reich, yet they succeeded in reshaping the post-war world. They didn't deliver the miracle victory that Hitler and his propagandists promised, yet they gave both superpowers the tools they would use to prosecute the Cold War. They cost enormous resources and caused tremendous suffering in their development and deployment, yet the knowledge gained from them advanced science and technology in ways both beneficial and terrifying. In the underground factories where slaves died building V-2 rockets, in the test stands where jets screamed into the sky for the first time, in the laboratories where scientists split atoms and imagined unimaginable weapons. The modern world was being born, for better and for worse. The secret weapons of Nazi Germany were ultimately a failure as war-winning tools, but as harbingers of the future, as prototypes of the world we now inhabit, they succeeded beyond anything their creators imagined. The archives are still being mined today, still yielding new information about projects that never made it past the blueprint stage, about technologies that were abandoned or destroyed before they could be completed. Occasionally, artifacts surface. A crashed Me-163 pulled from a lake. Documents discovered in an old warehouse, reminding us that there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered. Still questions to be answered about what Nazi Germany was developing in those final desperate years. What remains clear is that in their rush to develop weapons that might reverse their fortunes, German scientists and engineers created technologies that would define the second half of the 20th century and continue to influence us today, a legacy as complex and troubling as the regime that spawned these innovations.